Welcome to Second Take, the show that takes a look at the issues behind the news. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy this week confirmed that bid documentation is being prepared for the so-called emergency procurement of 2,000 megawatts of electricity generation to close a prevailing supply-demand gap. Terence joins me to discuss this development. Hi, Terence.
Hi, Chanel.
Can you give us some background on this development as well as the 2,000 megawatt figure?
Well, the background is really South Africa's chronic shortage of electricity generation capacity and energy coming into the system. And we know that that's led to a protracted period now, over a decade of unstable supply and load shedding. And we've also had an electricity plan that was outlined in 2010, published in 2011, the Integrated Resource Plan, by which we started to procure new capacity and new energy to enter the system. But that plan was very much out of date, with the supply and the demand side not coming in line with that plan. So we went through a process of updating the Integrated Resource Plan, and eventually in October last year, we got a new document and gave us new visibility, including this 2,000 to 3,000 megawatt immediate supply side gap. So that's where the 2,000 megawatt figure comes from. But we know that figure has been, there's been various figures that have come into the public domain, because when we entered our latest load shedding crisis in December, and we had stage 6 load shedding for the first time ever, Eskom then announced that the immediate shortfall was closer to 5,000 megawatts. So we've, DMRE, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, is meant to try and close this gap, as well as align that closing of that gap to the Integrated Resource Plan. And that's where we are at the moment, where we've got a concurred with ministerial determination for this 2,000 megawatts. And now the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, through the IPP office, is going to be preparing bid documentation.
This is not the only ministerial determination before NERSA, though.
Now, that's correct. Actually, the big frustration here is that there has not really, even though we've called this an emergency program, we've shown very little urgency. And in the intervening period, we know that we now have had the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, which has led to a massive fall-off in demand. It's created space for Eskom to do much more maintenance. The load shedding prognosis is now much more favorable than it was in January and February. And, you know, what the RRP really should all be really all about is implementing as per that schedule that's outlined to the allocated technologies, which will give us, in most cases, the least cost new build solution for South Africa's energy system or electricity system. And that is predominantly solar and wind generation, supported by some sort of flexible generation in the form of storage, which you could also use the existing coal fleet to provide that some of that flexibility, even though it's not the most ideal solution. So we have a second ministerial determination, which is before the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, that really allows for that procurement program to take place. But again, there we've seen massive delays in actually moving ahead and getting concurrence, and there's going to have to be public participation, including public hearings, which we didn't have for this 2,000 megawatt initial determination, which is now being concurred without public hearings. So we're going to initially go into this request for proposals for the 2,000 megawatts at a time when the emergency capacity, the emergency has passed. And actually what we should really be focusing on is the main allocations, including the distributed generation allocation in the RP, which allows for self-generation by companies, by mines, by factories, by farms, as well as by households. But instead now we are focusing on this so-called emergency 2,000 megawatts, which is really short-term supply, which is going to be very expensive and won't necessarily be here sustainably. And again, it distracts us from the main meat of implementing the Integrated Resource Plan 2019.
Besides these two programs, what other schemes are underway to help close the supply gap?
Well, I think that's also important because the supply gap is now lower than it was before COVID-19. Eskom itself is allowed to enter into short-term power purchases and has initiated a program to mop up any surplus generation capacity that may be available. And they are expecting to get about 129 megawatts through a request for proposals that they issued to the market just before the lockdown. And in addition, we have existing wind and solar plants that are operating around the country and have power purchase agreements that fall below what they're actually able to supply into the grid. So that would be another 129, 128 megawatts of capacity. And then Eskom's also looking at various demand side management solutions. And we know they're reintroducing the Power Alert program. And all told, they think they can get about over 900 megawatts of supply and demand short-term remedies, which will help close the gap. We already know that they're only expecting possible 3 days of load shedding during winter, which probably can be mitigated depending on how demand recovers post-COVID. There's no doubt that we need additional generating and energy into the system, but whether we should be focusing our attention on securing these short-term 2,000 megawatts of short-term, very expensive immediate remedies, or really getting the distributed generation market going through liberalizing the whole regulatory and framework, especially for municipal procurement, as well as for self-generation by big companies and such as the mines. That seems to be a better value for money proposition than pressing ahead with this 2,000 megawatts of emergency supply procurement. But it is what it is, and I suppose some people will at least say there's been at last some movement on implementing the Integrated Resource Plan 2019, which is already out of date entirely, given what's happened with COVID, and we're going to have to update it. So we now need to get to a position where we update the IRP as well and have a more realistic view of both supply and demand. But what is clear is that we need additional new generation capacity, but we should do it at the least possible cost. And the emergency program is definitely not that.
That's the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis. Also, don't forget to listen to the audio version of our Engineering News Daily email newsletter.